As we begin the month of October, at least here in the United States, we observe Respect Life Month, that this is a month dedicated to asking those questions, those deep questions about the meaning, the dignity, and the value of human life. Once begun at conception and only comes to its conclusion by natural death. And so as we begin this month, here we are on the first Sunday, and we're confronted with a very pointed teaching on the indissolubility of the covenantal relationship of holy matrimony. And so this is what I would like to do with you this morning is, I think it's a good occasion, especially too given that we are just weeks away from an election, and on our state ballot is that Constitutional Initiative 128, which if passed would be disastrous. And so, considering all these things, I kind of want to take the opportunity just to discuss something that is very difficult, makes an awful lot of people uncomfortable, and even some simply downright angry. But nonetheless, we have to do it anyway. Because as that famous saying goes, the unexamined life is not worth living, is it? I think it's always good from time to time to pause, reflect, tell the truth, and then ask God for the grace to convert and take one step closer to Him. So how I want to begin, I'm going to start by saying, is that in no way, shape, or form am I going to impugn anyone's motives or call into question their intentions, whether good or even whether deliberately bad. That's not the topic of conversation. That's not going to be the topic of conversation. So, to end your curiosity, I'm just going to come right out and blurt it out. I want to say a couple things about contraception, because I think it explains an awful lot about what we are experiencing today in our culture and in our world. And it's a topic about which we need to be honest, sometimes brutally honest. When we look at the 20th century, and the widespread availability of contraception that began in the 1960s, we saw something happen to the covenantal relationship of holy matrimony between a man and a woman. That with the availability, and you can chart this on a graph, with the availability of contraception, divorce tracked parallel with it until it peaked at just over 50%. Now, some people would like to say, well, that's all good and fine, but correlation does not necessarily equal causation. But in this sense, is that true? Is it merely a correlation, a coincidence, or is it causation? And I think that's a question that we need to examine and reflect on honestly. Because I think the answer is manifest. Following upon the widespread availability of contraception, abortion came out of the shadows, or, as some of the opponents of life would say, out of dark rooms and back alleys. And it became very public. And why? You know, in the past, I've had pushback on this because people think this is just far, far too cynical. They think that Planned Parenthood is a benign healthcare organization. And it's like, don't be so deceived. Don't be so deceived. Planned Parenthood is a business. They have a business model. They know that contraception is going to fail at a certain rate. And that for every woman who walks through their doors to obtain contraception, that there's a high degree probability that if that contraception fails, then that woman is going to return to their clinic to seek a solution. And that solution is generally not a happy one. And so the business model of Planned Parenthood is based on the very high predictability of contraceptive failure that is going to net a number of abortion that is going to result in their bottom line. It's a business. There is nothing benign about it. They destroy human lives, unborn children and their mothers. Make no question about it. We all know, as Roman Catholics, that marital intimacy is ordered to babies in bonding, to put it in layman's terms. Babies in bonding. But when it becomes only about bonding without the possibility of babies, bonding doesn't happen. There is no bonding. The divorce rate demonstrates that in spades. But then what it does, because it separates babies from bonding, then it puts non-marital intimacy into a whole new playing field, where, freed from the demands of the covenantal relationship of holy matrimony, people can pursue their passions according to their own particular interests and desires. And so there not only is no babies, there's no bonding, and now we live in this hookup culture. And so many wounded and broken people that if they had known, they would have never intended the consequences, that they have made themselves incapable of a lifelong, loving relationship with another in the sacramental covenant of holy matrimony. They've been too wounded. They're too broken. You know, the thing it's not amusing. You know, I use that kind of like more in the ironic sense of the term, but you know, it's kind of amusing that, you know, contraception was supposed to bring with it the promise of liberating women. But you know, that at the end of the day, the only one it liberated was men. It liberated men from responsibility for their actions. It liberated men from the demands of sacrificial love. It didn't liberate women. It made their condition worse. Much worse. But what has resulted in this liberation? We find that it has only created great contention and tension between the sexes. Isn't there? Great tension between the sexes. There's this distrust, this competitiveness that never once existed before. Why? Because now gender roles are confused. And unfortunately, there are forms of radical feminism that have convinced women that in this liberation, their liberation is to be found in imitating the vices of men. And that's a lie. Men aren't liberated by their vices. They need to be liberated from them. And to be liberated by contraception so that you could be the worst of what a man is doesn't make you a woman at all. And then come upon those heels is not just this tension between the sexes and gender roles, but now the whole question of gender identity. Who am I in the first place? And so the net effect is that what we have seen in this climate, in which we live, is basically the remnants of a battlefield of the war against marriage and the family. In fact, in these past number of years, you have come to know Pope Francis as someone who speaks very pointedly and at times very inelegantly in ways that people find offensive. And not wishing to be misunderstood in the issue, called contraception a weapon of war. Because it's a war against marriage, it's a war against family. And if you can destroy marriage and family, which is the very foundation on which society is built, that society will become unstable. And in its instability will produce violence. And so, here we are. And it's like, okay, all of that's good and fine. But that sounds like an oversimplification. But it's not. Let's look at today's gospel. Seems benign enough, right? It's just a simple question. Jesus, is it lawful for a husband to divorce his wife? And Jesus turns the table and says, well, what did Moses command you? And he said, well, Moses said, a man can write a bill of divorce and dismiss his wife. And how does the Lord respond to that? Because of the hardness of your hearts. Because of the heart. What does it mean to be hard of heart? Well, first of all, we have to understand the heart. The heart is the very center of our being. It is the place of decision. And to have a hardened heart could perhaps be the result of a couple things. Here's what I want to suggest with how Jesus is using the word hardness of heart. That at the time that Moses gave the law, the people were not in a place to fully receive the truth of God's creative intention regarding the covenant of holy matrimony as an indissoluble union between one woman and one man. They weren't ready yet. They were not in a place. Their heart was still hard. And so he opens their minds and says, in the beginning. Yeah, that may have been what Moses said because of your condition at that time. But listen, in the beginning, this is what God intended. He made them male and female. And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. One flesh. And we're not talking about mere physicality. We are talking about the entire embodiment of the human person. Mind, body, and soul. So intimate is that union between a husband and his wife. This was God's original creative intention. And the Lord said, because God has made it so, we cannot make it unso. You can't change things that God has ordained. The order, that he established. He established it for our flourishing. And so we have to ask that question. Has the introduction and the widespread availability of contraception, has that promoted human flourishing, or has it invited nothing but death and suffering? And you know the answer. And so don't get mad about it. What Jesus Christ is inviting us to do today is to go into, that deepest center of ourself, into our heart, to that place of decision, and renew once again all of the data and our experience, in the world, and to be honest about it. To just be honest about it. St. Paul says in his letter to the Romans, I believe it is chapter 12, or maybe it's chapter 8, I always get them goofed up in my head. But he says, do not be conformed to this present age. He says, rather, be transformed by a complete renewal of your mind, a whole new way of thinking. So like I said when I began my remarks, I said there is no condemnation here. I'm not impugning anyone's motives or calling into question the goodness or badness of anyone's intentions. Okay, as the saying goes, it's water under the bridge. I'm not stupid. I know everybody has been there, done that, and is wearing the t-shirt. Okay? But that doesn't mean we can't stop right now and in a moment of decision, realize we were terribly, desperately wrong. To ask God for the grace to listen anew to his original creative intention, trusting in his mercy to heal the wounds, to heal the brokenness, and by his grace put us back on a path that will promote and make more abundant our human flourishing.